Welcome to everybody. So we begin our sixth Rodolfo De Benedetti lecture. We were very glad to know that John Van Reenen had accepted to deliver this lecture. Also because the Fondazione is named after Rodolfo De Benedetti, who in his life, and the Fondazione is inspired to his personal example, has been a very important entrepreneur, and also a person who has been able in his life to choose and to appoint managers. We are publishing these days on the Fondazione webpage, and perhaps we can try and show to you the e-book with the autobiography of Rodolfo De Benedetti. And this e-book is very revealing and very insightful, because it's really is a story of really entrepreneurial talent and how business was run at that time across the war. And there are also very interesting examples of cases in which also the business of the had to be run from distance, and managers were appointed. There is a case, for instance, of Ingegnere Ugo Ardizzone being hired to run a firm, and so with an important capacity to choose, to appoint, to select the person, and to really establish a relationship with the managers. Unfortunately, family business sometimes don't have these characteristics. We have been studying these issues as Fondazione Rodolfo De Benedetti, and sometimes the managerial style that is requested by family firms in Italy does not correspond to this model in which performance is so important. But anyhow, I don't want to take more of your time, and I would like immediately to give the floor to the Chancellor, to the Rettore of Bocconi University, Guido Tabellini, for some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Tito, and welcome. It is a great pleasure to open this lecture for several reasons. First, because the foundation, the Rodolfo De Benedetti Foundation, has a long pedigree of very exciting research on applied and very relevant issues, and we are very glad and lucky to host it here at Bocconi. It is a great benefit to our students and to our faculty. These lectures, too, have a long tradition. They have been interrupted for a while, but the previous one are very frequently cited and are still remembered very often. The second reason for being glad to host this conference is the topic and the quality of the speaker. Luigi Guiso will talk about John Van Reenen, so I will not say anything about him. Let me just make a few remarks on the topic of the conference, which is of great relevance to Italy and to this university. We all understand how the key challenge that we face in this country is to relaunch economic growth. And this is not just a policy challenge, it is also an intellectual challenge, because I think it would be cheating to say that we really understand why growth has been so disappointing in Italy over the last decade or so. Certainly, the answer to this question on growth lies with productivity, and we have to improve productivity, but that too is a mystery, and it's not clear at all what to do in practice to enhance productivity growth. And one of the people who has shed light on the issue of productivity is precisely John Van Reenen, in particular with his ideas that management practices have a lot to do with the productivity performance. In particular, bad management is responsible for poor productivity. But this in turn begs another question. Why do we see bad management practices? Why don't firms get rid of these bad management practices? And why don't we always see the best practices adopted? And that too is a key question for this university, which specializes in management and economics and prides itself in bringing together these two disciplines. Now, existing research, much of it by John van Reenen and also by this foundation, has underlined two ideas to answer the question of why do we see differences in management practices and why do we see the survival of bad management practices. One is lack of competition, which reduces the incentives to improve management practices. And the other is the trade-off that family-owned firms have between choosing managers which are loyal and managers which perform well. I have no embarrassment in saying this in front of Carlo De Benedetti and Rodolfo De Benedetti, because the group that they had has a reputation of being one of the best managed groups in Italy, and of course I can witness personally to the talent and professionality of their management team. But nevertheless, in the on average, there is this trade-off between loyalty and performance, which is one of the determinants of the adoption of management practices. Much more can be said about this question of what leads firms to adopt specific management practices, but I will let the speaker talk about this. Before that, I turn the floor to Luigi Guiso, who will introduce the speaker.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce John van Reenen to this Rodolfo De Benedetti chair. Let me say, as a kind of proof that management matters, Guido was appointed to be a manager of this university, and my impression is that there's been a lot of improvement since Guido was appointed. This is casual evidence without a standard error, so we cannot make much of an inference. But I think it's important to notice. I think it's kind of obvious to me that management matters, and I think it's out of question that having better management matters for the performance of the economy. Although this is kind of natural to think in this direction, was also obvious for economists, and I will come back to this point later on when I will stress the merits of this research line that John van Reenen and his co-authors have been pursuing in the past 6 or 7 years, and why it has been successful. So John is a professor of economics at the LSE. Let me spend a couple of words just picturing who is the speaker. He is the director of the Center for Economic Performance, and last year he was awarded the Hero Johansen Award for the best economist under age 45, I think, in Europe. This is an extremely important award. It's the most important award in Europe, and tells us about the academic standing of our speaker. He's a very active protagonist in the debate, in the economics debate in Europe, and has been serving, providing help in fostering economics in a variety of ways, providing his expertise and knowledge to our profession. John got his PhD from University College in London, and I think the way he approaches economics and the attention and relevance that he puts in the collection of the data, the analysis of the data, the attempt to get the best quality data that he can, and also the ability to squeeze all the juice from the available data, I think stems from the fact that he was trained in that particular school. Last year I was talking to his thesis advisor, to Richard Blandel, And Richard told me that John was his best student ever. So given the source of the statement and the credibility that Richard has as an economist, I think I would take this as a very serious judgment. Now, the academic profile. John is an applied economist in the sense that he does mostly empirical work. He's an empirical microeconomist with an interest in understanding what firms do. But it applies these tools to a broad set of issues, including empirical industrial organization and the effects of regulation, labor economics and personnel economics, research and development and the incentives that firms have to innovate, wage policies and firms' profitability, wage settings and inequality, and firms' investment and uncertainty. So the research is intense, is rich, and is varied. It has appeared in the main outlets for our professionals, in the American Economic Review, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the Journal of Political Economy. For some of you, these journals may say nothing, but for us are a kind of God. So the whatever I would say the topic that it deals with, it does so using microdata, looking at the micro underpinnings of the question he is looking at. But there is always a macroeconomic implication in the way he looks at the problem. So the important feature is the combination of a micro approach with macro relevance for the topic. So the current research is what has gained John the most attention from our profession, and also outside the circle of economists, and what he has been calling the bossnomics, the boss economics, the managerial, the importance of managerial practices for understanding economic performance. Now, traditionally, these issues have been confined outside of economics and were kind of monopolized by managerial studies. And were mostly based on case studies. Now, the attention was mostly directed at the importance of managerial practice for the survival of the firm, the existence of the firm, the management of the firm, and so on. But in this way, I think we are losing the possibility of understanding and assessing the importance of managerial practices for the broad economic performance of a country, a region, a state, and so on. And I would say that John's main contribution in this project is to have reverted this tendency and to bring and brought to the attention of a much broader audience the importance of managerial practices. And in particular, to show and to document the importance for the macroeconomic performance as a whole. So, and the other contribution is that they have broadened our view besides entrepreneurship and stressing the importance of management in order to understand economic performance. Economists have always focused on the importance of entrepreneurship, leaving aside management. So I see in what they have done at least the three important contributions. The first one is a contribution about measurement, in the sense that they have been setting up new survey-based tools in order to come up with comparable measures of managerial quality across firms and across countries. Now, this may seem as an easy exercise, but it's not. And this is the preliminary step in order to be able to assess the importance of managerial practice and to say something that is not purely vague, but is quantitatively grounded. The second is that they have provided evidence that managerial practice do indeed affect firm performance. As I was saying, it is kind of obvious to me to say that managerial quality matters for the performance of the firm, but showing how much is a different issue. And the third is that they've been massively documenting that there is a huge dispersion across firms and across countries in the quality of these managerial practices. And they have been able to isolate a number of correlates of managerial practices with potential determinants. I couldn't say at this stage that they are really the bottlenecks that are causing these differences in managerial practices, but at least they are helping in identifying a potential set of variables that may be important in fostering the adoption of the best managerial practice. So for this, I think we should recognize that this is an extremely ambitious research program, and this, however, very much rewarding both from an academic point of view, but I would say from a practical point of view. And that's why it has gained so much attention, because it combines novelty and relevance. So I would say that I strongly recommend you to pay the maximum attention to John's Reenen lecture. Thanks.
Himself has been contributing to this literature, because there is a study on Italian managerial practices in which Guido has been contributing to with very important results. So, John, I think now the floor is yours, and also in light of what Luigi was saying, perhaps you should add another question. Not only does management matter, but also by how much does it?
Well, thank you very much for that too kind introduction. I feel that it's going to be hard for me to live up to the very kind words that Luigi has said. And my work itself has been very much influenced by his own work, and indeed by many of the people around the table. So let me dive into the subject of tonight's work, which is bossonomics. Does management matter? I have to say, I presented this once in Brazil, and everybody looked at me and said, is this about the bossa nova, which is the famous Brazilian dance? I had to explain, no, this has nothing to do with bossa nova. This is all to do with the economics of management practices and why I think they're actually very important. So, in the world, as you know, bosses don't always have the best reputation. So, the management is often the subject of many jokes, television shows about how bad they are. Indeed, there was a film in English called Horrible Bosses, which, as you can see, was all about the problems of dealing with difficult bosses and why they were making their workers' lives very difficult. But I want to argue in this talk that, in fact, as Luigi has said, that management is actually key to thinking about growth and what could be more important to us at the moment than understanding growth, and also in understanding the differences of productivity across different nations. So it's really important to try and get a handle on it. And my talk is going to take us to many strange places. So I'm also going to be looking at different factories. Here's an example of a relatively well-run factory in Nokia, where you can see a clean and well-organized factory, to places we've been, such as Belarus, which has, as you can see, high capital equipment but very few workers. Everyone's on a mysterious break. To India, to a family-owned textile company outside Mumbai in India, where we have been doing some experiments to try and look at the effect of management and productivity. So I'm going to give you a bit of a whirlwind tour around some of the issues to do with management practices in these different places. So the structure I'm going to talk about is, first of all, what is productivity? I mean, we think management affects productivity, but what is productivity and why should we care about it? Then I'm going to talk about some international comparisons of productivity, focusing on Italy. Then to get on to why this productivity gap exists and argue that although many things are important, such as technology, management is also one of those key things. And then talk about finally, what can we do to improve things, both in the long run and the short run? So what is productivity, and why should any of you really care about it? Well, Paul Krugman, who is a good friend of the CUP, once made a good quip, and he said that, this is from an economic point of view, productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And the reason he said that is that ultimately productivity growth, which is how much output you can get per input, per labor input, per other input, really in the long run drives the growth of wages and therefore our consumption. So really, in terms of long run wealth, productivity growth is absolutely key to understanding that. And if you can get high productivity growth, it can also favor redistribution as well. A lot of people say, well, economists are focused on productivity growth. What about inequality? And inequality is important. But if you care about inequality, it's much easier to redistribute in the context of a growing economy because of productivity growth than it is because of a stagnant economy or a shrinking economy. It's much easier to divide up the pie if the pie is growing. And it's particularly important during our current era, our era of debt crisis, of austerity, when we're trying to get more out of every euro spent. If we could somehow get more productivity out, that would actually mean that the degree of austerity we need, of cutbacks in spending or increases of taxes could be relieved. So it's particularly important at this current point. So what is different ways we measure productivity? Well, a basic welfare measure economists use is kind of output or GDP per head of the population. And you can always divide that into 3 different bits. So the first bit is just GDP per hour worked. This is what's called labor productivity, is what a lot of economists focus on, and that's going to be our focus this evening. But it's always good to remind ourselves that that's not the only thing which affects output per person. How many hours people work, if they're working, is also important. That's to some extent a kind of a choice of labor supply. But finally, the other component of that is how many workers there are in the population, the employment rate. So clearly issues to do with unemployment, inactivity, demographic change are important for that. So that's extremely important. Unemployment is extremely important. That's going to be the subject of another lecture, because tonight I'm really going to focus on the first part, which is to do with the kind of the productivity part. It's also worth reminding ourselves that people often talk about growth in a very loose way. From the perspective of people, what matters really is growth per person, not absolute growth. Absolute growth you could get by just having more children or more immigration or increasing the size of the population, which may or may not be a good thing. But what matters really is growth per person, because that is what ultimately can mean that people can have more material well-being, or you choose to spend it on leisure or whatever else they might want to do. Okay, so my little screen here has now gone blank on standby. So I'll continue, but I'll be looking at the screen. Okay. So how do we measure productivity? Well, as I said, outputs per worker, so I can use this. Labor productivity is output per hour, and it depends on lots of things. How many inputs you put in, such as plant and equipment, human capital, and so on. There's a limit to how much you can do that. There's a limit to how much you can keep on increasing the numbers of computers per person, and even education per person. And the thing that economists really focus on is this rather ugly term, total factor productivity, which basically means how much you can get out of all your inputs when you put them together. So sometimes it's called the solo residual. It's the bit left over that we can't explain. And it actually accounts for actually most of long-term growth and much of the differences in wealth and productivity across nations. But as Luigi Guisa said, of course, that says, what causes TFP? It kind of puts the question one further back. But it's worth just looking at TFP across countries, this unexplained part of productivity. And if you put on this is putting on the horizontal axis per capita GDP, per capita national income, and this is all relative to the US. So this is countries which have half the per capita GDP of the US. This is with like 1/36 of GDP per capita of the US. And this, on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, plots out total factor productivity. And you can see from this a very close relationship between the two. At least in a statistical sense, what it counts for a lot of the riches between nations is actually how good they are at being efficient at their total factor productivity. It's also worth reminding ourselves when we look at this is the differences here are absolutely stunning. So, Tanzania down here has only 1/64th of the GDP per person of the United States and 1/32nd of the TFP. So another way of thinking about this is an American worker with the same kind of capital, the same type of materials and so on, in a day produces what it takes a Tanzanian worker to produce in a month. So that's the scale of productivity differences we're talking about, absolutely vast. And if somehow, obviously, we could improve things to bring some of these countries up towards the OECD countries, this is a huge potential prize in terms of wealth and development and the alleviation of poverty. Okay, so how does Italy score on some of these factors? Here's a simple way of looking at it. So this is just this measures of GDP per hour taken from the conference board, looking at a few different countries. So I'm used to presenting this and saying, look at the UK, we're doing very badly compared to other countries like the US and Germany and France. But Italy, unfortunately, is doing much worse even than the UK. And that's pretty bad, I have to say. So there's about a 30% difference in productivity in terms of output per hour between the United States and Italy. So, that's a big potential prize if that gap on productivity could be improved. Perhaps even more worrying than the level of productivity is what's happened to the change of productivity. So this looks at the growth of productivity over the 1995 to 2005 period. This is pre-crisis, and looks at the average annual rate of labor productivity. So you can see that productivity was doing pretty well in the US, going around about 2.3%. Not bad in Europe as a whole at 1.5%, but Italy was much slower, only about 0.5 percentage points a year. So rather slow productivity growth in Italy. And then during the crisis period, or covering before and after the crisis period of 2005 to 2010, then you can see Italian productivity has actually declined on average over these years, whereas in fact in other countries it's going to continue to increase. So that's a particular worry, I think, being here in this country. What are the things that we could do to reignite growth in Italy, to reignite productivity growth? So why is the gap? Now, lots of reasons here. I'm not going to go into every reason, but the things that economists have traditionally looked at is what you might call hard technologies. So things which are to do with technological advance. And this is partly true. A lot of work I've done in the past has looked at technological innovation, and it's certainly true that many countries which are less productive have an innovation deficit. And the same is true of Italy. If you look at the commercialization of innovation, research and development or patenting, these are only crude measures, but they tend to be much lower in Italy than other countries. So for example, this is only a crude measure of innovation, but if you look at the amount of national income given over to research and development, then you can see that Germany, the US and Japan devote something like 2.5% to 3.5% of their income towards research and development. The UK, again, is not doing well at all, less than 2%, but Italy, even worse, around about 1%. And these kind of factors are very important. Innovation is very important in terms of understanding differences in productivity. But I think that we need to move away from just thinking of innovation as a very narrow sense about hard technologies, and also think about innovation in the wider sense about the way in which firms are managed. For one reason, many of these technologies that people look at, like information and communication technologies, are available all over the world. Yet some countries and some firms seem to be able to get a lot more productivity out of the use of information technologies than other countries and other firms. So, and this seems to be to do with the way they manage those two new technologies. So the idea that you just throw technology at the problem, I think, is inadequate. It's what you do with those tools rather than just how much you spend on them. So then the question is, well, how do we possibly measure, quantify, and compare management? It's a very elusive thing. So, my research program really the last 6 or 7 years with Nick Bloom at Stanford, Raffaele Sedon, who's an Italian, one of my former students, who's now at the Harvard Business School, and my team has really been to look at trying to get better measures of this and try to understand why management is so different between firms and countries. So I'm going to give you some examples of the kind of questions we use of how we measure them. But let me just talk you very briefly through the kind of methodology that we use, because I think it's important just to give a brief understanding. So we've developed various management questions which we think are important for productivity, and that's developed through talking to a lot of consultants, a lot of industry specialists, over the type of things which in firms seem to be important for productivity. And these are around things like monitoring what goes on in the firm, setting sensible targets, how you manage your people and your incentives. And as I say, I'll give you lots of examples of those, and we have lots of them up on our website. If you're interested, you can go up to our website and score yourself, if you like, on our online tool to see how well managed your organisation is. Becoming extremely well managed, I have to say, in terms of those scores. We deliver this through a 45-minute telephone interview of in this, what I'm going to talk about, many manufacturing plant managers, although now we've done this for schools, for hospitals, for retail, and many other sectors. So we have this telephone interview, we try and get information out of this. We choose plant managers because they're kind of in the middle of the company. They're obviously workers right on the shop floor may not know what's going on across the whole plant or firm. CEOs often, unfortunately, don't know what's really going on inside the company. So targeting these people, these middle managers, we thought was the best person to try and get an idea of what's going on. The problem is, of course, that people don't always tell you the truth. So how do you try and get the truth out of people? It's very difficult. But we've developed this technique we call the double-blind technique. And the way it works is that the people doing the interviews, the interviewers, know nothing about the company's performance. We deliberately select kind of medium-sized firms between 100 and 5,000 employees, typically not firms you may have heard of. And the people doing the interviews don't know anything about the productivity, the performance, the profitability of these firms. So they're not, obviously if you were interviewing a company you thought was great, like Apple, you might give it a really high score, but we don't interview those really big companies, they're more the medium-sized companies. The second part of this double-blind thing, it's blind for the interviewer, but it's also blind on the interviewee side. So the managers that we interview are not told in advance that they're being scored. And this is very important because if you know that you're being scored, you're much more likely to give the answer you think the interviewer wants to hear. So that blindness on both sides actually helps us get more accurate responses, and we do a bunch of things to try and show that there's evidence of that's the case. We also ran this all from the same place. So every few years the LSE gets turned into a glorified call center where we have a large number of MBA students making these phone calls, calling up and talking to managers. And that helps in terms of getting consistency across the answers across different teams. Finally, you might say, well, why on earth would any company participate in these interviews? I mean, it sounds like an awful lot of work. But the way we get them to, we get a pretty high response rate from our surveys, usually 50 or 60%, and they seem to be pretty random. And the way we can do that is we introduce this as a lean manufacturing interview. We don't ask financial information, so people aren't worried about giving away company secrets. We get official endorsement from reputable institutions. So we've got endorsement from the Bank of Italy, for example, when we interviewed Italian managers, from the Bank of England for the English managers, and the Federal Reserve for the US, the Bundesbank for Germany. Different things work in different countries. So we found that in Germany, when you have the eagle crest of the Bundesbank coming through saying this is a good study, then the German managers are very responsive. So they respond very well to the authority of the Bundesbank. By comparison, in the United States, if you try and interview a plant manager in the Midwest and you mention the government, then the guy will say some words I can't repeat in polite company and slam the phone down and call you a liberal communist or something. So we found that in America it worked a lot better saying this was a study being done by the London School of Economics and Stanford University. It was done by MBA, so the Americans responded a lot better to that. And as I mentioned, we've employed about 100 MBA students so far to do these surveys. And those of you in the audience who have taught MBA students will know that they can be challenging to teach, But the advantage of using them for people getting interviews is they tend to be loud, assertive, they've got business experience, they're much, they don't like taking no for an answer. And that is a very good thing to have when you're trying to get a good response rate. So we get a pretty high response rate. Now, what are the kind of questions we ask? Well, there's a whole number of them. They're all in the papers and the website, but just to give you a flavor of some of them. One of the questions we want to find out is how performance is tracked in the firm. So good firms tend to be very good at measuring and tracking their performance. So we score firms between a 1 and a 5. A 1 is a low score, a 5 is a high score. The low quality firms, the low scores, would be if measures are actually not tracked or unrelated to business objectives. Many processes aren't tracked at all. A good score would be trying to really measure performance very frequently, and then communicate this. A lot of companies get information and then they lock it away in the door and don't show the workers or other managers what that information is. And part of actually a good practice for monitoring is actually to try and display that information in a way which is easy to understand and can be used to try and track what's going on. Having this type of tracking of information and the use of data is actually a key tool in many management practices. Another question is around, we have a set of questions around people management. So how do you deal with underperformers, how you pay people, how you promote them? So here's a question on promotion. So we would be trying to look at how the promotion system works. So a low score here would be that people are promoted purely on the basis of tenure, ignoring their ability or their effort or anything else. Whereas a high score would be if you try and actively identify and promote high-performing people. So you take into account their ability and their efforts, you do appraisals, you follow those appraisals up. So that's another example of a basic question. Now, when we try and ask these questions, we don't simply ask, are you promoting people on the basis of tenure? Because then again, people will give you answers you want to hear. We just ask them open-ended questions. We say things like, imagine you had a manager here who has been working for a year. Talk me through how the promotion system would work. And from that discussion, that open-ended question, we use that to score the manager. So we actually get a much richer type of information than you would from just ticking a box by sending out a survey. So we think that enables us to get much more reliable information than you would normally do from these type of surveys. So now we've actually surveyed, this is an out-of-date slide, over 10,000 firms across across 20 different countries. We've got about a 45% response rate. It seems to be pretty random, and these are more kind of medium-sized manufacturing firms. Although, as I mentioned, we've now done these in many other areas like schools, hospitals, and retail firms. So, do these questions tell you anything about what's going on within a firm? Well, the first thing that we did was we looked at whether these were correlated with outcomes that managers might care about or that shareholders should care about. So this is the correlation between their measure of labor productivity and the management practice score across our thousands of firms. And you can see there's a pretty tight correlation. So the better managed firms tend to be more productive. Similarly, the better managed firms tend to have higher sales growth and I guess this is key for many of the managers in the room, a higher degree of the rate of return on capital, a higher degree of profitability. Now, this shouldn't be taken to think this is proven causality. This is a correlation, and I'm going to come back to the question about are these management practices causing productivity later. But it shows you that there's some information in these management scores. If these management scores were just random nonsense noise, there should be no relationship with things that people care about. And in fact, there's quite a tight relationship. Another thing people say, well, a lot of these management things we've talked about, trying to monitor what your workers are doing, giving them strong incentives, having different targets. These are all kind of, culturally biased measures. So you might think that these work in America or in the United Kingdom, but they don't work in other countries. So this is the correlation between management and productivity across a number of countries. So you can see, yes, in the US and the UK, there's a relationship there. But the relationship is also just as strong between management and productivity in China and Japan, in Italy, Portugal and Greece, France, Germany and Sweden, Portugal. But basically every country you've looked at, you see that this relationship is here. And I always say, if you think this is culturally biased towards the Anglo-Saxons, it's hard to explain why Britain actually does rather badly on these management scores, which I'll show you is actually sadly true. So here is the ranking of management scores across our countries. And if you look, this is just the average score in each country across our thousands of firms. And unsurprisingly, the US does very well, so it gets a very high management score. It's also the highest productivity, main productivity country. But you can see that there is a kind of Serie A, or Premier League, of countries who do very well in management, Japan, Germany, and Sweden. And then a group of other countries, including Italy, the UK, and France, who do rather badly. And then at the bottom, the countries who do really badly are countries like the developing countries like India, China, and Brazil. When we first did this, we were very surprised that we first did this in 2004, 2006, and Greece was right down there with the developing countries. And people said, well, obviously you're mismeasuring Greece, because Greece is a rich European country. But subsequent events with the crisis have suggested that, in fact, there are serious management problems in Greece. But what's actually more important, I think, than the average scores across countries is what happens within countries. So this gives you, this looks a bit complicated at first, but it's actually very simple. What this does is for every country, it plots out the distribution of management scores across every firm. So, for example, in Italy, this looks at all the firms and it says, okay, we've ranked the firms from 1, which are worst managed, to 5, which are the best managed, and the height of the bar is basically the proportion of firms in that score. So the fact you see a very high bar here shows you that there are a lot of firms around the average, as you'd expect, but and there's less few firms at the extremes. These are the very well-managed firms. But what's really striking in Italy and every other country is how many really badly managed firms there are. So no matter what country, in the UK, for example, here are firms which are basically not monitoring what's going on the production line. They're not communicating that to any workers. They're promoting people purely based on how long they've been in the firm. They're paying people regardless of their effort and their ability. They're not having got any joined-up sensible targets. It's amazing to economists how these firms actually continue existing, because we think the market should drive them out very quickly. But in all countries, those low-productivity firms do exist. And it's also kind of striking that the US does very well, but the US also has some badly managed firms. And some of a country like, say, India, although on average it's badly managed, also has some very well-managed firms. The big difference between the US and many other countries is actually that the US has relatively few very, very badly managed firms. So just to blow that up and compare, say, Italy and the US, the higher score of the US in our management quality measures is primarily driven by the fact the US has very few of these really terrible, really badly managed firms. Whereas Italy, like most other countries, has a thick tail of these badly managed firms. And it immediately makes you think, well, what is the reason for this? Could this be to do with competition? It's quite possible, and we'll show you some evidence on this, that the American economy is much better at more ruthlessly weeding out the very badly managed firms. It's very hard for them to survive, and they get weeded out much more quickly than they do in other countries. So, this Darwinian process might be much stronger in the US than it is in Italy, and indeed in my own country and other nations. So before I get on to some of the reasons to explain this difference between countries, I'll just mention one of the great things about, which is unusual for an economist, about talking to plant managers, talking to the people that you're studying, is that you can talk to them. They can tell you some interesting things. So as you know, in my country, there is a thing called the traditional British chat-up line, which is, if you want to try and persuade a girl to go out on a date with you. One of our managers, this is actually a male manager speaking to a very attractive Australian female interviewer. The production manager said, "Your accent is really cute, and I love the way you talk," with the Australian accent. "Do you fancy meeting up near the factory?" So, what girl could resist a tempting offer to meet near a production factory somewhere in the north of England? Well, this girl did. She said, "Sorry, I'm washing my hair every night for the next month." So that was the phone call ended there. Things are different in India. So the Indian chat-up line is somewhat different. So I don't know if I'm sure many of you know in India there is this kind of caste system. So the Brahmin caste, which are the very high caste people, rarely will go out with the low caste people. So, and the Brahmin thing is very important to establish whether you're a Brahmin or not. So the production manager asked an Indian interviewer, a female one, he asked her, "Are you a Brahmin?" very directly, and she said, "Yes." "Why do you ask?" Her heart sank because she'd actually heard this before. And the next question was, "Are you married?" "No." "Excellent, excellent. My son is looking for a bride and you could be perfect. I will contact your parents immediately to discuss this." So you can see that the cultural differences are very important in terms of these management interviews. So what are the things which affect the quality of management? So the first thing we focused on was competition. So as I said, there's two ways in which competition could affect management quality. First of all, there's a selection effect. So as I showed you when we looked at the distribution of management scores, it might be that competition just has this effect because it roots out the underperforming, badly managed type of firms. So the badly managed firms are more likely to exit when competition is higher. The other way that competition could help is it could actually force the badly run firms to actually try harder to survive. So the incentives might change and the managers may work harder to kind of improve management quality. So in our work we find that both these effects matter. Both the survival and the effort effect matter. And a very simple way to see this, again, is just to plot out. We asked them, this is 10 plus, we asked the managers to say, how many competitors do you think you faced between 0 and 10 or more? And you can see, if you correlate the quality of management with the degree of competition, there's this very strong positive relationship between the two. The more competition seems very, very clearly related to the quality of management. And you can use many other measures of competition, and we get very similar type of results. Interestingly, in the public sector as well as in the private sector. A second thing which is related to management quality is labour market regulation. So in particularly, we have a section of the survey around people management, like the promotion questions, the pay questions, how much effort you put into finding good quality people and hanging on to good quality people. And if you correlate the degree of employment rigidity using this is like the burden of labour market regulation, you find that in countries which have very high labour market regulation, the people management scores are much lower. So where hiring and firing is very expensive, very costly, you tend to find much worse management. So Italy has a very low score on this compared, say, to the US. So that's certainly not as low as Greece, but certainly a very high degree of employment rigidity and a relatively low management score. A third factor, and this, in some sense, we weren't surprised by the competition effect and the labour regulation thing. I think we were more surprised at was a third factor to family firms. So family firms have been a long-standing of interest to many people, and the kind of concern is that family firms maybe have a negative effect on productivity. So one way in which family firms could have an effect is through ownership. But in fact, ownership, if a family owns a big shareholding block, can actually be beneficial for productivity of management. Because if you have a bigger ownership block as a family, you might be able to monitor what the CEO is doing to make sure that he's working sufficiently hard. Whereas the big problem, and this is the problem that we find, is if the firm is owned by a family, but also puts the son or family member, particularly the eldest son, in charge. And this is a very common practice. And the problems with what you think you might worry about these family firms which put the eldest son in charge is that it reduces the pool that you could select the CEO from. As Warren Buffett said, of all the people in the world who could be, say, Italy's contenders for the next Olympics, would you want to choose the eldest son of the people who won the gold medal 21 years ago? You might do, because they might be the best people, but you'd want to have more of a competition to look at other people who may be better runners or better athletes. And there's also other effects that having a family firm could have, such as if the son or family member knows that they're going to be the CEO, it may reduce the amount of effort they put for education. And it also has an effect on other people who are managers in the firm. They may, if they know that the family, if they're not a family member, they're never going to get the top job, there's less of a career incentive. This is not to say that every family firm is badly managed, but on average, it may not be the best way to select your CEO. Italy, of course, as many of you know, has a lot of family-owned firms run by the eldest son. So something like there's 3 times more primogeniture firms in Italy than the US, and this is also something which Luigi and his co-authors also found was an issue in understanding Italian CEO behavior from their study. So if you just look at the management scores across these different types of ownerships, you can see that when you have a family-owned company with a family CEO, the management score is pretty low, kind of close, even worse than some of these government-run firms. Whereas if you have a family-owned firm where there's a non-family CEO, the management quality appears to be much, much higher. Almost as high as it would be, say, in these firms with dispersed owners or private equity. So that does suggest that there might be a problem with preponderance of family firms. The fourth factor is human capital. So we collected information on education of managers and non-managers, and these appear to be very strongly linked to good management practices. So it's kind of unsurprising, but if you look at the percentage of managers who have college degrees, for example, then you find in the firms where managers are better educated, a much higher management score. But interestingly, that's also true of workers. So having high human capital of both workers and managers is a way of actually potentially making it easier to improve management practices in the firm. So, that's maybe not surprising, but it's actually good to see that so clearly in the data. And finally, I just mentioned one final thing on one of the potential drivers of management, which is multinationals. So what we do in this graph is we plot out the mean management score for domestic firms versus the mean management scores for foreign multinationals who operate in the same country. And the kind of interesting thing here is, this blue line looks a lot like the line I showed you before, but multinationals appear to be well managed in almost every country they operate in. So even in a country, in India, where the average domestic score is very low, the multinationals appear to be able to do very well in terms of their management quality. So to me, that's a very optimistic message for business managers, because it says that the kind of environment doesn't necessarily completely determine how well managed you are, because foreign firms, multinationals, can come in and actually bring new management practices with them in order to kind of improve productivity in the countries that they go to. So kind of to summarize, there's four main factors, which plus the multinational thing, which seems to be important: product market competition, labor regulation, meritocratic CEO selection, and human capital. Those 4 things essentially account for almost all of the management gap between Italy and the US. So I think if we acting on those things could really help bridge this management gap in Italy and in other countries. Okay, so this suggests that management is important, but I haven't really shown you any evidence that the skeptical economist in the audience can say shows you causality. So there's a correlation between management and productivity, but is it really causal? Well, one of the ways, it's very hard to get at this causality question, but one way that Nick Bloom my co-author, has tried to do this is actually to run some experiments. So in India, what we've tried to do is we've selected some Indian textile firms outside Mumbai, and we've marketed a program to them, together with the World Bank, to give a treatment group some management consultancy, so kind of world-class management consultancy services over about 4 or 5 months, and also had a control group of plants who got some very light consultancy, basically just enough so we could get data to compare the two. So they had, in the management consultancy jargon, both sets of firms had what's called a diagnostic, where we got data to kind of measure the quality of management, and then the treatment group had 4 or 5 months of help to introduce the type of practices that I've described to turn the company around. And the results were very dramatic. We collected weekly performance data on these plants for 2 years, and we saw very big improvements in the performance and productivity. So to give you some idea, these interventions led to improvements in profitability of about $200,000 a year. So that more than would have paid for the consultancy cost. To give you some idea about what these plants look like, so these are some of the pictures that we took before the interventions of the plants. So you can see that these are all textile plants. You can see this is the yarn in one of the storerooms very badly stored. You know, this is in the monsoon season, this gets wasted away. Lots of rubbish which is uncollected. You know, Nick took this picture. He was a bit worried about getting too close to this toxic chemicals when he took the photograph, because he thought that if one of these fell over, you know, that might be the end of him. So, you know, many parts of these factories were very dirty and unsafe. If you looked on the factory floor, you can see things like a lot of cotton lying on the floor. This is an old warp beam used to roll the kind of cotton yarn. This is a broken one just lying, blocking around the tray. This is an instrument which has been broken but not removed, oil leaking from some of the machines. So lots of problems in these factories. One of the things which we tried to get the factories to do was to put up these kind of lines. This is kind of the 5S program, to try and place machines in a more ordered way around the factory. These are kind of yellow snag tags. So when anything went wrong with the machine, there was a snag tag placed on the machine, and then a process for fixing up broken materials, fixing up these broken problems, and collecting the data on these so that could be analyzed and improved and communicated in the way we've said. So a lot of these things are very basic, very kind of common sense type of practices, but led to very big improvements of productivity. So here's an example of the quality defects. This is the kind of quality defects in the treatment plants, which, on average in the treatment plants, which improved dramatically, a lot fewer defects after the experiments compared to the control plants, where productivity or quality in this case more or less stayed the same. So potentially very big increases from this kind of, and this is a randomized control trial, so this is like a kind of drug trial where you give some patients a kind of treatment and another group of patients a kind of placebo drug. Okay, so that does suggest that there are ways in which you can improve management, and that leaves us with the question about, you know, what can we do to improve things in the West. So I'd say there's kind of short run changes and long run changes that we can do. So in the short run, and of course, you know, all that I've spoken to you about today is about long run differences in productivity and long run differences in management. But in the short run, of course, what we have to think about is dealing with the immediate crisis. And you know, I've written obviously about this in other contexts, but I think Italy and other countries, the United States, you know, included, the key thing is to have a credible plan for debt reduction over the medium term. I mean, without that reduction of public debt, that's, you know, nothing is going to really calm the markets down. But really, in order to keep the Eurozone going, there needs to be, I think, three things. So I've got two things here. There's a third thing. The first thing is, I think, has to be agreed an orderly debt restructuring in Greece and probably allowing it to leave the euro. I think that's pretty clear now that Greece is insolvent. But around countries like Italy, which are solvent but illiquid, there needs to be a firewall place. There needs to be strong protection around member states from the possible attacks which are going to be on Italy because of fears of what's happening in the rest of the Eurozone. And the third thing is recapitalization of banks. So I think that in terms of the banking system, I mean, and I say this very sadly because I think that as myself and many other people said, that after the crisis, banking reform was one of the key things we needed in order to reduce problems with the banking system. So we wouldn't really need this kind of level of recapitalization. I think it's inevitable that we need to do this if we want to avoid a serious problem with a bank run. So those three things: recapitalization, protecting the solvent countries like Italy, and orderly restructuring in Greece are the kind of priorities that we need in terms to deal with the short-run problem. But we need to go beyond that. So the world as a whole, in my view, needs fiscal and monetary policy to stimulate demand. And my big worry, I think, from a UK perspective, is at the moment we have almost like a coordinated austerity, which is kind of reducing demand. So both in the US and parts of the EU, we're embarking on very fast austerity programs, which are likely actually to maybe push the world into a second recession. So although we need to have this credible plan for long-run debt reduction, and we need obviously to deal with the euro crisis, without having a sensible speed of that austerity program, we run the risk of pushing ourselves into a recession. So, you know, I really believe that it's important to think about that. Now, This is all a short run, I think, short or to medium run problems. In Italy and other countries, we need a long run plan. So I think the debate amongst economists is focused very much on the things I just described in this slide. But in order to actually establish long run growth, we need structural reform. I call this a plan V. So in Britain, we have a plan A, which is hard austerity. And now people are thinking of a plan B, which is to have a slightly slower pace of the spending cuts. But in my view, we need a plan V, which is how to avoid a double-dip recession and get a kind of V-shaped recovery. And that very much in Italy and other countries is about a kind of growth strategy. So in my view, there are a number of structural reforms to improve management and productivity which could be part of this plan V. So firstly, product market competition. So I think there's many areas in Italy and elsewhere where there is a role for much stronger product market competition, both in terms of competition policy, in terms of trade policy to re-establish the Doha round, but also more broadly in the form of deregulation and allowing more competition in the public sector. So I think in Italy, one of the problems that you face is that many professions are highly regulated and there needs to be a reduction of the barriers to entry to allow more competition, to allow new firms to enter into those sectors. It relates very closely to labour market regulation, as we've discussed. I think there's a role for allowing more flexible labour markets. I think the problem in many countries like Italy is, what's developed is that insiders have a lot of power due to strong labour market regulation, which has meant that outsiders to the labour market, such as many young people, like those of you in this room, are struggling to find jobs. And rather than having this kind of two-tier labour market, it would seem to be more sensible to have a kind of a unified contract, which didn't have the same level of very heavy protection for insiders that many countries in Europe suffer from at the moment. The third thing, as I've said, in terms of thinking about management as human capital, the government has a huge influence on this, both in terms of education and also skills. And I think it's important to think about this. Not just people talk a lot about the worker skills, but in terms of managerial skills, there's an important role for business schools to play. Places like Bocconi, other types of business schools can be part of trying to develop a new cadre of good quality managers to actually help improve management and productivity. So I think the role of business schools in fostering growth shouldn't be underestimated. I think there's a role for development of that market as well. Fourthly, meritocratic CEO appointment. I think this is, in terms of public policy, you certainly don't want public policies to encourage family ownership. In my country, we have lots of pro-family ownership policies. I'd rather have a level tax playing field. But I think this is more of a question for kind of business people in the audience, is to think about, it may be that the elder son is the best person to have in charge of the firm, but it's more wise to actually think about a wider field. And if you look in a wider field, it might be that the elder son is the best, but it may well be that there might be many other people who could be appointed who would be better than that person. So having meritocratic CEO appointments, I think, is going to be very important. And as I've said, openness to foreign investment, the multinational issue, and also financial market regulation is going to be key as part of this long-run growth plan. So in conclusion, sources of productivity growth, I think, on technological innovation are well studied, whereas the questions of management are rather understudied. So I hope I've stimulated your interest to think more about these issues of management practices and how they may be part of the reasons for the wealth of nations and growth across countries. In my view, management productivity can be improved by microeconomic structural reforms, especially over these issues of competition and human capital and labour markets. And although the immediate crisis requires concerted action on debt plans, it also requires thinking about the demand side as well. On the positive side, often countries find it very difficult to reform. And it might be that the crisis could be an opportunity to actually make the kind of reforms which are needed, the structural reforms, in order to provide for long-run productivity growth. So let me end with a couple of my favourite quotes again. These are some of the fun quotes that we've had from talking to managers. One of the questions we ask in terms of managing people is how you try and keep your good employees. So this is how the Americans try and do it. So if an employee suggests a company slogan, his name is used, he gets a TV. if he gets the employee of the month, he gets a parking space. So that's a wonderful reward. The UK, again, has some slightly different ways of keeping its good staff. The interviewer asked, how would you persuade your top performers to stay? And the chairman said, sex is a great thing. If the employee finds a new girlfriend somewhere else, I can't do anything. So that's the big problem in the UK, as to how to have sex to keep your employees. India, of course, is an interesting place, and things are somewhat different there again. So somebody asked, how do you identify your star performers? And the manager said, this is India. Everybody thinks he is a star performer. And actually, one of the interesting things, we looked at how managers thought how well managed their company was. We just kind of asked them that, how well managed do you think you are? And the answers they gave to those questions were totally uncorrelated with how productive the firm was or how profitable the firm was. So people's perceptions of themselves are rather at variance with how things actually are on the ground. So one of the problems, I think, with improving management is that people are actually unaware of how good or how bad they are. And let me end you. So Americans do well on many dimensions of management productivity, but they don't do well on all dimensions. So on geography, for example, American education could be somewhat lacking. We asked one interviewer, how many production sites do you have abroad? And the manager in Indiana, US, said, well, we have one in Texas. Well, thank you very much.
The work you have done in this survey and in devising measure of managerial quality is really impressive. And I've been looking recently at a number of highly ranked journals of management, and it is very hard to find good data for sound empirical work on managerial quality and the effect of managerial quality on performance. So really, the work you have done really paved the way for a lot of work and very good research on this topic. So that was an additional reason why we're so pleased that you accepted to give this sixth Rodolfo De Benedetti lecture. There are here students studying between economics and business administration. There are managers in this room. And there are professors of business administration. So I think it is the right crowd to be very much interested in your work. And I'm sure they have questions for you. So we will take a few questions, and I'm sure you then will have. So we give priority to students as usual. No. So there is one. We take a few questions.
So it seems like in the United States, the importance of management is inherent in business culture. I mean, you have CEOs who have these elaborate programs like Six Sigma to focus on management. But do you think that in countries that don't have it in their business fabric, it's necessary for the government to intervene? And if so, what kind of policies can the government pursue to improve management in firms?
However you like, how much I answer?
Yeah, why don't you?
Yeah.
So
thanks very much for that. I think the cultural element is important. I've actually been surprised from some other work I've done. Culture really does seem to matter as telling us in the business of understanding the differences that happen in organizations. Can you hear me okay?
This conference is being videotaped, so it's very important.
Okay. That's much better. Okay. So yeah, culture's important, but I don't think it's all determining. I mean, culture does shift and does change over time. And I think that one of the interesting things about looking at multinationals is that when multinationals come into a country, even though they're employing workers and managers of the same culture as the local country, they're still able to change management practices. So when I showed you that kind of chart, which showed that in India or in Italy, the foreign multinationals are very well managed, especially American multinationals, people often say, oh, well, that's just because they've also imported, American managers or Japanese managers. But typically, 97% of the plant managers we interviewed came from the local country. So what I think happens is that at first, when a Japanese firm invests, say, as they did the car manufacturers in the UK, they initially bring in some of the foreign managers. They change the organization, change the culture, whatever you want to call it, and then actually are able to improve the management practices. So I think that shows you the potential. Now, what can the government do about it? I think that's much more challenging. I mean, I focused on, in some sense, the structural impediments. So, in terms of competition, of regulation, of human capital, the government does have an indirect effect on these things. There are programs which have more direct influences, so that offer, management training for small and medium-sized enterprises. I think some of those have a role. I mean, often it's about providing information of what the best practices are. Unfortunately, there's relatively few high-quality evaluations of those. So, I've spent a long time looking to see how we can try to persuade governments to do more evaluations to see whether the programs which they have actually work. But governments are extremely resistant to do that. So I think that we don't know is the answer whether these more direct interventions by governments really can have a positive effect. I think in principle they could, but as usual in practice you need to have good evaluations to work that out. Great PhD topic for the students in the room, by the way.
Yeah, perhaps it is also something that government should not do, which is to prevent capital flows to come in to defend and to protect the national firms. And we know something about that, I'm afraid. Here there is another question. Alfonso Gambardella.
John, thanks a lot. This is very, very interesting, very, very inspiring research. So let me ask you one question about one specific dimension of this topic. I mean, we know that one of the foundations of economic growth is really the rise of new entrepreneurial firms, so startups, new firms, and so on and so forth. Now, a typical feature of these new firms is that they are, quote unquote, badly organized. At least they are very chaotic. We don't see these firms as being the firms that actually put everything in the shelves and things like that. So one view is that many of these organizational practices then come into the picture later on when firms have grown and firms have actually become more stable and so on and so forth. Now, clearly not other dimensions like the meritocracy or other parts of this. But I wonder whether, first, whether you have looked at this aspect of the problem, and second, whether in the bad tail of managerial practice, you actually have many of these young firms, or at least whether the distribution is somehow correlated with age. Because in this case, we may want to distinguish this kind of chaotic creativity, which is indeed something that it's good, rather than being bad.
Yeah, thank you, Alfonso. It's a really excellent question. We do, when we look at this analysis, we always control for age. So that is one of the things we definitely were worried about. And it's true, in fact, that the very young firms, exactly as you were saying, when they first start off, tend to be much more chaotic and bad. Not all of them. In fact, some of them actually, some of them are often spun off from bigger companies, and they take some of the good practices with them. But yes, on average, the new starts tend to be less well organized, more chaotic. And part of the reason that we decided to focus, as we have done, on firms who are at least 100 employees is because it gets to a certain point when in the dynamics of the firm when you grow, that very informal method of managing people no longer really can be done so well. You don't know everybody in your firm. So at some point as the firm grows, many of the practices that we've talked about have at that point to be introduced if you want to be more efficient. So I think in my view that what we're looking at is one particular point of the growth of firms. I think that the entrepreneurship is very important, but I think that it's often underestimated how important it is for the wealth of nations, how firms grow after a few years when they've entered. And I think a lot of the barriers that you see in developing countries and many European countries is not so much barriers to starting up an entrepreneurship, but barriers to be able to grow after you've got through that first difficult few years. And I think, there's lots of reasons for the barriers to growth being there, but I think one of them is, the difficulty managers have in changing what they do. They have to, at some point in their lives, let go of some of the reins, allow some more of these slightly more formal practices to come in. And that's the very difficult transition period. So I think that's the kind of point we're putting at, and that's not to underestimate, exactly as you say, that, at the early life cycle, things often can be crazy, and that's an inevitable part of the growing up process. A bit like my 4-year-old daughter.
A great person like Paul Jarosky was used to say, entry is easy, survival is not. I think it's...
John, thanks for your talk. I'm Charlie Williams in the strategy group. It's great to get this nice overview, kind of high-level overview of all your work that is so interesting. One thing that's striking to me here in a business school and thinking about management is you called this set of practices best practices, but they seem much more like, at base, reasonable practices. And where it really seems to be making a difference is taking out the lower tail of just promoting people because they do well, rewarding people for work, monitoring your performance. And yet we in management, as scholars, tend to focus on the high tail, and we put a lot of our time and effort in there. I guess I'm just curious how much you think this center is a moving target, or is a diffusion so slow that we really need to be focused on this just very basic set of reasonable practices that firms ought to be following and really aren't?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I should have said. I mean, this is a big proviso of our work. Is we're focusing very much on kind of practices about, given what you do, how could you do them more efficiently, rather than maybe I should be doing something completely different. Maybe my pricing policy is wrong. Maybe I should be spinning something off. Maybe I should be merging with another firm. Maybe I should be doing my advertising. A lot of other, much more at the high-end strategy end, and we're kind of, not really touching those type of things at all, which are incredibly important, but where it's much harder, I think, to kind of think about what's best or worst practice. So we've kind of focused on this more narrow set of things, where we think, we can arguably get something closer to a kind of, good and bad type of scale. I think that, the tail is very important. So that's what I kind of focused on. But I wouldn't also underestimate, the importance of maybe pushing, I hate to use this term, from good to great, to, really trying to push up things at the upper end. So I think, we also see effects coming up from the pushing up at the upper end. I think the big prize is the lower end, actually. And I think it is a slightly moving target as well. I think, one of the things that we think is important is the kind of collection and use of data and putting that into the incentive models that firms have. And that's been enabled, I think, partly by the fact that data is much easier to collect and analyze and use now than it's been. So, maybe 100 years ago, spending effort to collect all this type of data would not have been, worthwhile. But now the collection of data and analysis of data is much easier with IT. I think has moved that practice along a bit. So there's definitely some type of an evolution, but I agree. A lot of these things aren't rocket science.
Yes, we have another question.
Hi, thank you very, very much. My question is actually related to the fact that at Bocconi, a lot of management teachers tell us that management is not a science, it's more of an art. So my question is related to talent. And I was wondering if one of the dimensions you might have looked at was the ability of firms to attract, retain, and nurture talent as part of their practices.
No, absolutely. In fact, if I'd have had 2 hours, I could have gone through all the different practices that we had. In fact, when I teach an MBA course in Stanford, and we actually, one thing we do is we just go through all of these kind of practices and kind of talk about them. And if you look at we call this the people management or talent management or incentives part of the program, I put up the kind of things on promotion. I mentioned about removing poor performers, but 2 of the questions are exactly on the thing that you mentioned. It's on the kind of the effort put into trying to attract people, and also on kind of retain people, and particularly on trying to attract and retain the kind of good performers. And we're looking for things, particularly I mean, for example, in terms of some of the best run firms in talent management, they actually incentivize the managers not just on how well they perform, but their ability to retain and attract other really good quality management. That's kind of hardwired into the system. So those things on retention and attraction of talent and the practice around that are absolutely one of the 2 of the 5 people management questions that we look at.
First, thank you for the lecture. And my question is actually, I believe that most of the recommendations that you gave, are actually could work out in countries, also like Italy. But my question is also have you been considering to also support these studies, doing a study on the roots of mechanism? Why do certain people behave this way and not the other one? So what I mean is, for example, that maybe there are some problems, differences in the perceptions, how people perceive the relationships between each other, or about the work ethics. So
could you just repeat? I didn't quite catch what you said in the second part of the question.
The mechanism, why do certain, because this is all about recommendations. So what I mean is this is the solution, but maybe trying to see it as well from why do these countries do it this way, and why do other countries do it this way. So maybe for this solution, it could be easier to understand why, if we understand the mechanism. So the drivers of certain people to, to perceive a work ethics, for example, differences among different countries. And from this part, to go to the solution that you gave. But what I believe that it could be sometimes more easier to understand, and as well to, for a country later to take this and make own solution adaptable to the own realistics of the country. This is my.
Okay, let me kind of approach that question in a couple of ways. I think that every country has to do things differently in terms of structural reforms, because a lot depends on the politics of the country, which of these things are possible or difficult to do. Guido Tavolini has worked a lot on these political economy issues. In the context of Italy, for example, I'm not sure what the right way to do it. I can say that moving on these dimensions would like to help. Exactly how you sequence the reforms is going to be quite challenging. But I think there are. It's kind of one of the reasons that we started doing this work was in response to the feeling that many people had that all management is contingent. So doing this one practice in one firm or one country could be good, but another the same practice would be bad somewhere else. And there is indeed heterogeneity, but we see that there is a strong kind of communality of these practices being associated with better management, almost regardless of, on average, which context you put them in. So I kind of think that although there is some degree of specialization, the dominant thing we see is that these things all tend to be associated together in the same firm. Having said that, there is some elements of specialization across these different practices. So although as I said, the dominant factor is firms tend to be good or bad in all of these, you do see across firms and across countries specialization. So in some countries and some firms, there's a much bigger specialization in the kind of people management practices, the kind of hiring, firing, attracting good talents, and so on. And a much lesser emphasis on what you might call kind of capital-intensive things like lean manufacturing, monitoring, and so on. And so, for example, particularly in a country like Japan, the Japanese practices seem to be very, very strong in lean manufacturing. That's going to come from the Toyota system, but somewhat weaker on some of the kind of people management practices, whereas the United States is the other way around. It's kind of tends to be strong on the people management practices, but worse on some of the kind of more capital-intensive type of lean manufacturing practices. So there's definitely a specialization and differences across countries in these things, which opens up the possibility for some differences across different countries. But my gut feeling is it's somehow the bigger thing is the common what's common across countries rather than what's so different.
Are there other questions? Yes, one here on the first row. Oh, and then finally we have some managers to say something. Yes.
So first of all, thank you for your lecture. I have a very basic question. I was very impressed by the fact that you realized that the firms owned and managed by the founders were really poorly managed. I was impressed because normally we think about a firm which is owned and managed by its founder as a firm perhaps not such complex, but where the social function is very emphasized, and also the whole firm is managed in a very unitary way. So perhaps I would say that I wouldn't say simply that it's poorly managed, but perhaps we should adopt another scale to evaluate that kind of management. So I was really impressed. I want you, if you could spend some words on that.
Sure. It's very much relates to Alfonso's question about entrepreneurs and startups. So I think that the reason that founders seem to score badly on our scale is that we're looking at these more formal practices, and in many firms still run by the founder, they tend to be young, they're a bit more chaotically managed, they're smaller. So a lot of the relatively low scores of the founder, I think, are related to the age, the size, and so on. I think what happens is that in our sample, because you have to be at least 100 firms to get in, have 100 employees to get into it, the type of firms which are still run by the founder, even though they have 200, 300, 400 employees, that might be a signal that that they're not the best type of managed firms. So I think that a lot of it is probably, I think in some ways, yes, maybe we need to have a different scale for entrepreneurs, and we could think about the startup founders, entrepreneurs as being on a different scale. But there may still be some truth in the idea that some of these firms, the founders refuse to let go, even after maybe the firm has got much larger than they're able to manage in the same way that they did when they first founded the company.
Okay, I think in your research that in Italy we have a problem, a big problem. But one of these problems may be that we have too many owner or firm that make manager, that want to be manager, and few real manager in our economy. And another one, do you think that the result will be the same if you do the research in the service sector?
So to answer your second question, we have now done this in the retail sector and in the hospital sector and the school sector, which I guess are all service sectors, although obviously the school sector is kind of public sector. And we find similar results in the sense that our management, we have to obviously, some of the questions have to change. I was talking to the department of Bocconi today about hospitals, and although some of the questions are the same, like promotion, other questions are different. Operations mean something different in a hospital than it does in a manufacturing firm. But broadly speaking, we find similar type of things in the sense that high quality management practices are associated with better outcomes in hospitals. Better quality management is associated with greater mortality, higher quality, people less likely to die in hospitals which are better managed. Kids get better school results and better managed schools. And at least in retail, the cross-country ranking looks a bit like it does in manufacturing. We haven't done that in so many countries, but the US does relatively well compared to the UK and Canada. So many of the same kind of things are coming out. Your first part of your question was in Italy, are there enough good quality managers? Was that right?
Very small firms that have no manager inside, where the owner is the manager, and this is a problem, I think.
Absolutely. So it relates very much to this issue of there's a lot of small firms, a lot of family-owned and family-run firms, And you would think that in many normal markets, those firms would struggle to, you know, if they were efficient, then they would be fine, they could grow. But if they were very inefficient, you expect them to be driven out by the marketplace. So the fact they're not driven out by the marketplace might, you know, suggest that the forces of competition are not, you know, working strongly enough, or there is something kind of, not all of the firms, but some of them, keeping them on a kind of artificial life support system. And that, I think, is you know, the issue. One of those artificial life support systems might be that too many families want to maintain control of the firm, putting their own family members in that firm, rather than seeing the opportunity to grow. I mean, of course, there may be good reasons for that. So it might be that maybe it's hard to get finance to grow. And if financial, you know, the sources of finance are weak, having a family member is, you know, the second best type of solution. But I think, you know, you put your finger on it, there is definitely an issue about whether this long tail in Italy really is an efficient way, and could some reforms be done to, you know, encourage the better of those small firms to grow bigger.
Franco, there is a, please, now here. Franco De Benedetti.
Thank you very much for your lecture. If I remember well, the companies that you interviewed are in a sample between 50 and 3,000 people. Now, notwithstanding the importance of their contribution to the total GDP of the country, I think that the extrapolation to the performance of the whole country needs probably some explanation. Thank you.
No, that's a very good question. So it's true that we're only looking at the medium-sized manufacturing. Well, in this talk, in the medium-sized manufacturing firms, we cover between 50 and 5,000. So in most countries, that covers the kind of majority of workers employed in the manufacturing sector. But you're quite right that, as Alfonso said, it leaves out some of the smaller firms, and it leaves out some of the very big firms. And the reason that we did that was because, you know, if you're interviewing one plant or two plants of General Motors, that's not going to give you a very, you know, good, it's not going to be a sufficient way of getting a good measurement of General Motors' overall performance. So there is definitely an issue of how we can extrapolate from the sample we have. But the sample we have, unlike, and there's been a lot of emphasis on economists of looking at these very big firms. In fact, you know, in the business, in the kind of management community and the economic community, we tend to focus on the very large firms. Industrial organization is almost all focused on the very largest firms. And although I think that's important, and my work has done that, I think it kind of misses out on where the bulk of the economy is, which is actually the much more typical firm, which is more representative of the country it's located in. So, you know, there's a question about when you think about very large firms, like General Motors or like GlaxoSmithKline, you know, to what extent are they rooted in the country they're in, or to what extent are they actually very global? So I think that although what we're seeing is not the whole picture, I think as a kind of representative snapshot of a big part of the, you know, understudied economy of the country, it's an important thing. I mean, some of the work we're doing in the future, we're trying to get at some of these larger companies and persuading them to let us run our management survey across lots of plants within those companies. But that's still work in progress.
Are there other questions? Well, then, one there, and then this will be the last one because really we have to close.
Hello, I really enjoyed your speech. So my question is, did you find any relations between the top management networks, the power of top management networks and performance? Because I think also like the power between top management teams is also the links, the relationship between top management teams also has a very, it's quite important for a firm's performance. Thank you.
Yeah, we haven't done enough of looking at kind of the CEOs and the CEO team yet. I mean, that's one of the things that we like to do more work on. I mean, I can tell you one statistic, if you like, which is that we did look at the CEO's remuneration package, how much money the CEO was paid, with the idea that the better paid CEOs would, you know, induce higher management practices in their firm. And we found that indeed there was a positive correlation between how much you paid the CEO and our management scores until you put in size. So conditional on size, there was no relationship between CEO pay and management quality. Now, that could be that size is sufficient, it controls for all the CEO talent, or it could be that, maybe what matters in the firm is not just the characteristics of the CEO, but also more broadly how the firm is organized and the kind of, culture and structure of that firm. But managing teams would also be a good thing to look at, which we haven't yet done. I think there's a question here, isn't there?
Another question here? Very last one, really, because we're getting late. And so, one here.
Thank you for your enthralling lecture. Just to keep it short, you mentioned technology and management as separate factors, and I wanted to know if you looked at them together as interrelated factors.
Yeah, we have tried to do that. I guess one thing that we did, which seemed to be important, was looking at the adoption of information technologies. So we have a paper which looks at what happened when firms and plants in Europe get taken over by multinationals. And we found that American multinationals, which tend to use more IT, got more out of the information technology in terms of productivity than takeovers by other types of multinationals. And then when we broke that down, what seemed to matter was the interaction between the management quality, as I've described it here, and the use of information and communication technology. So there seemed to be a real complementarity between having good management, especially when it came to adoption of new technologies. And that seemed to account for a good fraction of the productivity differences across these different firms.
Well, thank you, John. I'm sure there are many other questions that you would like to ask, and I hope also that some of these questions will be the basis for further research. As we said before, the data have been assembled are very important to carry out sound research on these topics, and I hope that, given also the very many issues you raised tonight, there will be more work being done and dissertation being written on this topic. Before we close, just two announcements. The first is that the videotape of this lecture will be uploaded to the Fondazione website in a very short while. We will send a message to all those who register for this lecture to inform you about that. And as of tomorrow, you will have the slides that have been used today by John Reenen. So this was the first announcement. The second one is that the next Rodolfo De Benedetti lecture will take place, the 7th of the series, will take place in December 2012. And we'll have as a topic the top incomes and the economics of a superstar. And the lecturer will be Professor Emanuel Seitz. So this will bring us back to the beginning of the series that was very much based on income distribution. We had the lecture by Tony Atkinson, by Thomas Piketty and Alberto Alesina, and also Luigi Zingales covered issues related to income distribution. So once more, thank you so much, John, for your wonderful lecture, and I hope that we will be more and more research being done on this issue here at Bocconi. Thank you.
Thank you very much.